Whenever you guys are ready. If you want to open up the webinar. All right, Frederick, you want to get us started?
Right. Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to this webinar number 4 in our MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific Accelerator webinar series. Welcome to those of you dialing in early from Europe, and good evening to those of you dialing in from the US. My name is Frederick Nybeck. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator here in Singapore. Just as a quick reminder, we're hosting these webinars now weekly, every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Singapore time. The first 60 minutes will be live streamed on YouTube, followed by 30 minutes of closed door Q&A with our cohort startup companies only. So do mark your calendars for next week as well. The topic then will be manufacturing and supply chain management. So 10 a.m. Singapore time next Wednesday. With that, I'll hand over to MedTech Innovator CEO Paul Grant for today's session. Paul.
Hey, Frederick, thank you very much. Welcome to everybody. I'm Paul Grant, CEO here at MedTech Innovator. Great to have everyone participating today. So for those of you who haven't been here before, the way our webinar series works is all of our cohort companies are here in a Zoom. They can ask questions of our panelists. They can send me little messages in the chat, and I will try to address those questions during our first hour, which is also live here on YouTube. For anyone who's on YouTube, you can use the chat box in the corner to send us a question, and I'll try to get to it during our moderated discussion. For the last 30 minutes after the first hour, we'll go into private mode with just our cohort, where they'll have a chance to ask questions of our panelists privately. But this first hour is for all of you to join us here and have a chance to listen into our open curriculum here at MedTech Innovator. We want to make sure that the world's leading startups are getting the best advice possible. So we bring together experts from across the industry on a series of topics. And today we're going to be talking about product development. Now, product development is something that all of companies in this space go through in some way, one shape or another. In the design and development, there's lots of components to it. We're not going to be able to cover everything. Most of the companies in MedTech Innovator are a little further downstream, so they've got products that are in development at some stage. They've got prototypes, they've got evidence. Sometimes they're on the market. So we're going to try and tailor the questions today to their questions for the most part. So we're not going to be doing a complete 101, but we're going to cover some really important topics that should be interesting for anyone who's out there and listening today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started and introduce today's panel. We're really lucky to have a series of amazing experts today to talk about, as I said, product development and design. So let me start off and introduce each of our panelists. They'll tell you a little about themselves, and then we'll get into the questions. So first, let's start off with Biten from Johnson & Johnson. Biten, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, the work you do at J&J, and then we'll move on.
Thank you, Paul and Frederick, for the invitation. Very excited for our conversation today. I lead R&D for the vision care business of J&J for the Asia-Pac Japan region. I also have global responsibilities for product development for our contact lenses, particularly our cosmetic contact lenses and myopia control contact lenses. I've been with J&J for about 17 years across multiple of their medical device businesses, including general surgery, orthopedic surgery, blood glucose monitoring. About 25 years plus in R&D innovation, both internal and external. Always in the medical device industry, and pretty much a significant part of the career in the Asia-Pac region, apart from a few stints in the US. Thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
And I'm looking forward to it too. Thanks for being here with us, and thanks for reminding us with your background to see things differently. I can't unsee that now. Thank you, Biten. Looking forward to the conversation. Let me move on to Yanlin Lee from Cambridge Consultants. Want to tell us a little about yourself and Cambridge Consultants?
Hi, my name is Yanlin Lai. I work for Cambridge Consultants here in the APAC region as head of MedTech here in APAC. Cambridge Consultants is a 60-year-old company specializing in product development. So our bread and butter is creating world-beating, best-in-class products for our clients. And we work across the entire spectrum of medtech, from IVD, instrumentation, to surgical robotics, to class 3 implants, ophthalmology, and drug delivery devices. So a bit of everything. I myself have a background in startups as well. So I did 2 startups before I joined Cambridge Consultants. So I really understand the trade-offs that a startup needs to make between what you hope to achieve and the resources that you have at a given point in time. So hopefully we can balance the, absolute best, way forward versus what you can achieve at this point in time in terms of your development, and really excited to get stuck into this conversation.
Thank you, Yanlin Lai. So another great panelist. All right, let's go to our third panelist, Santhosh from Oliver Healthcare Packaging.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Santhosh. I am the technical service engineer here at Oliver Healthcare Packaging. Oliver Healthcare specializes in sterile barrier packaging for medical device, biologics, and pharmaceutical industry. It's been around more than a decade. From the late 70s, we have been in the medical device spectrum. And prior to joining Oliver, I was with Edwards Health, Edwards Life Sciences, and Zimmer, Zimmer Systems. My entire life has been in packaging. Been doing packaging for about 20 years. Out of 20 years, 15 years has been the medical device, doing product design, development. My role was packaging engineer, but I worked with a lot of R&D, regulatory bodies. So my entire life has been with product design. I really appreciate the opportunity today. Thank you, MedTech Innovator, for giving me the chance to share my knowledge and experience. And I'm looking forward for a wonderful discussion with the fantastic emerging companies we have, startup companies, and with my co-panelists. I hope to learn something today. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm hoping to learn something as well. I'm sure we all will. This will be a really interesting discussion. So I'm going to start off with a general topic here, which is, whether you're a large company or a small company, you have the choice of developing your technology either in-house or outsourcing it, and various components of that may be done in-house or outsourced. So maybe just kind of a general discussion on what criteria you might use to decide what to develop internally, what's important to do externally. Again, whether you're a small company or large company. And I'm going to start with Biten on that because you've got some diverse experience in this area. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, Biten.
Thank you, Paul. A very, very interesting question. And I think this is a dilemma which everyone faces. As you said, whether it's a large company or a small company, we all have to make choices of make versus buy. For me, the first criteria, which always has been critical, is being about what gets you speed to market. It's never about trying to take pride in your internal teams only. It's first and foremost, what's the best way to deliver the product? And the best way to deliver the product is how fast can you deliver the impact? That once you start answering that question, that allows you to decipher where do you have the best teams available. Do you have core capabilities in-house, or are there partners out there who can help you get to that finish in line faster than you can from your internal team? The second part, which is a little bit of a medium-term to long-term question, which you have to keep at the back of the mind while you answer the first one, is at an overall organization level, are you trying to build this as a core capability and a competency, which is going to be critical for your not only your current product, but also your long-term life cycle management for that particular product and following incremental innovations you may come up with. And then, of course, the third parts are purely financial aspects, which is, are you going to be paying more for the speed to market if you use an external resource, if that's the way it's going to go? Or are you more efficient doing internally and the time taken to build that capability? So you have to keep these few aspects in mind at the big picture level. before you go down to the brass tacks of the actual core engineering, which you need to do. And more often than not, that balancing act is always between question 1 and 2, which is, do you focus on the speed to market on the current innovation at hand, or do you also simultaneously solve your core competency development, which is going to be critical for long-term sustainability of that product line and also its knowledge base. And I think when it comes down to execution, more often than not, you will find that you can find a common ground in a hybrid model where you've got to have at least, even if you decide to go externally, make sure you have a couple of SMEs who can own that knowledge for you on a long-term level, and eventually convert that long-term competency as and when needed in-house. But don't shy away from using external resources if you believe that can get you to the market faster.
Good point. Very well taken. So before I move on, I just want to see if any of my other panelists want to comment on that. We don't have to comment on every single question, but starting up with this one, any other thoughts from anyone else want to share? Santhosh?
Yeah, so I agree with Biten on the business side of it. I think he hit the target, hit the bullseye with all the right aspect from a business standpoint. Since I've been an engineer, I would give the engineering side of it. And one of the main criteria where you want to decide between outsourcing and keeping in-house is if you're working on a device which has IP-related activities or which has patents or which has an intellectual property associated with it, definitely you want to keep it in-house. And some of the aspects you want to outsource is, for example, if you have a device which has multiple components and there are at least one component which is, let's say, a PVC tubing, which is very common part of the blood transfusion system, for example. And you have a pump, which is the core of the device, and then you have the tubing that goes with it. So you don't want to keep the PVC. You don't want to work the resources in-house and spend your resources on tubing and stuff like that. So I've seen companies who do a hybrid approach where they keep the part of the device in-house and they keep the part of the device to outsource and get that in parallel. So you're basically doing a speed to market, but the development activities are going in parallel at the same time. So I think the first point is IP. If you have something innovative and very creative and you think it's a therapy that's not been targeted before, then that's definitely you want to keep it in-house. Outsourcing is something like business related, accessory which are already in the market, less critical from a risk standpoint, plus activities which involves specification development right from the scratch, which has like critical specifications associated with it, design specifications. You definitely want to keep them in-house because you want to keep the design control in-house.
I'll just add to that on a very practical note. It's not binary, where if you decide today, it's all in-house, and then it doesn't mean tomorrow you can't do it, or vice versa. So what I've seen, we work with a lot of startups, and what I've seen is there's usually a very strong core competency that the startup starts with. That's the thing that makes them special. That's their USP, right? That's the reason why MedTech Innovator is interested in them. And that core area is what you must keep in-house, right? That's the special thing about you. But for example, if you're talking about a diagnostic instrument, the core competency may be that assay, that special chemistry. But to make the instrument work, you might need things like thermodynamics, microfluidics. You might need some packaging design about how you do your cartridge, and that shelf life kind of story. Maybe there's some optics in there. And what we see happens quite often and quite successfully is at the start. It's a small team, it's a startup. It will be less than a dozen people. There's no way you can own all the parts. So what ends up happening is a startup will hire people like us, where we can bring all the other teams into the picture, and it's immediate, right? You turn on the tap, you have all of them, all that resource at your fingertips, and that's great. But as the startup progresses, they hire teams along the way. So 2 months down the line, they may say, okay, I think optics is a really important part of my device, so I'm going to start skilling up and hiring that team. 3 months after that, they have a team, and then they take over that part of the project from us, right? And then over time, over course of 2 years, over the course of 3 years, they may end up owning the entire project, and they have all the competencies to do everything end to end in-house. But they didn't start that way. And so that's why I'm saying to you, you don't have to start that way where you have to do everything all at once or nothing at all. You can do bits and pieces and scale up in time with the different development teams that you need in-house. Also, the other point about IP is it depends on the partner that you work with. Some partners will take ownership of the IP if it's created during the course of the project, but our organization does not. So the IP gets assigned to the client. So there are definitely different ways to cut this cake, and it's entirely about the situation that you're in, what works for you, and how quickly you want to move forward.
Yeah, and I think on the topic of IP, since you brought it up, sometimes the IP might be a core capability at the company that you're partnering with, and you'll need access to that IP for your device. Are there any special considerations or anything that people might want to think about related to that?
Well, I would say don't boil the sea. If there is a party that has the IP but is very willing to license, you may want to just do that, because it might take you years to try to work around existing foreground IP. And one of the areas that we see that a lot in is in the electronics industry, where there's a lot of licensing of software stacks. If you want to enable Bluetooth in a certain way, there's lots of basically what I would call almost off the shelf, right? You can license for a set fee. It's very well understood how you go about it, and that's great. Don't work around things that are easy, okay? But where it is unique and special, and that's the differentiator, then absolutely you should spend the resource and find a workaround and carve yourself out a unique space that is defensible, because that's the other thing I think that most investors look for, is the technology that you're developing defensible, and one of the areas that gives you that is definitely IP that that's unique to you.
No, that's great. Thank you. So let me go back to you, Biten, for a second here, and let's talk about assessing all these different suppliers and vendors and people in terms of development. How do you, any advice that you would offer to, both identify who some of these different entities are and how you assess their capabilities? How do you validate that? And we can go to different panelists here for comment, but I'll start with you, Biten.
Great. Thank you, Paul. I was just maybe going to start with just acknowledging what Yen-Lin said about IP earlier. I think the models about 15, 20 years ago was companies were trying to own the IP and develop it themselves. The environment and the ecosystem have really expanded and also have become more flexible, where you could rely on your partner to either bring IP in and give you that license to practice the IP in your product, and or co-develop it, so long as you have the right to first refusal or to own it at a later phase. So, and the reason I allude back to that one is that a part of choosing the right partner, IP is actually one of the critical reasons in terms of how you choose your partner. What's the flexibility in terms of IP ownership, whether it's developed by them or co-developed, and then also in terms of the willingness to share in the terms. So there's an IP aspect to how you choose, but that comes a little bit later. The very first one is, as I mentioned, going back to my first comment, it's going to be your partner should be the one who has the credibility and the ready resources and the capabilities and capacity. When I say ready resources, capacity and capability to help implement your project deliverables right away. You don't want to choose a partner who is also in a development mode. And you see a plethora of different partners, even mature companies who bring in product development services. In certain niche areas, they will bring proposals to you with the concept that they will build a team for you. Now, that's why you need to make a choice whether is it better for you to then now take time and build a team, or do you let your partner build a team? So to me, again, speed to market in choosing a partner is, do they have ready capacity and capability available? with potentially similar projects which they may have done. If they have done exactly the same project, chances are you may not work with them because you might find conflict of interest with their previous customers or clients. So similar projects using similar stack of technologies, which you want to be mindful about. The second part you have to be thinking about is the engagement and interaction which you're going to drive between your team and their team. Who's going to do project management? A lot of times that is one criteria which is not discussed upfront between the service providing partner and the startup or the owner of the product concept. And therefore, you end up having challenges in terms of who's managing the program. So either you got to build the project management capabilities in-house, or you need to put it upfront that the partner brings in those project management capabilities, which also brings in a very strong communication cadence, information and knowledge sharing, and roles and responsibilities going back and forth to make that product development successful. The third one, which actually I call out third, but a lot of times it's always the front and center, is the cost aspect. More often than not, startups are always trying to manage their deliverables within certain budgets, right? They have either grants or investor money, which they're trying to manage expectations with, right? So cost becomes a big front and center aspects for them to choose the right partner. I think cost is important because you have a plethora of choices in many different parts of the world where you can choose a partner from. But you should not make cost your first factor. It should be a part of your negotiations once you've formalized the capability, the capacity, the IP norms. And then the fourth one, which I bring in, which actually I should have mentioned earlier than cost as well, is quality systems and design control, as Santhosh mentioned earlier, right? If you are as a startup in a phase where you have not built your own design control systems, then you want a partner who can bring that for you on the table so that the product development, the documentation can happen within their design control system. And eventually when you build yours, you can write bridging quality plans to transition that back into your team. So quality control design control and documentation services also need to be a critical part of selecting the partner. And of course, there are many other aspects, but I'll take a pause here. Some of the other things to be considered is, are they only going to provide your design service, or are they also strong in terms of design transfer and finding your manufacturing partner? Those could be additional factors, but I'll leave it here to see what other panelists may want to add.
Sure. Who else wants to comment? Yes, Santhosh.
Well, I wanted to comment, but I think Biten took all my points. I think he nailed out all the critical points that I was going to say. But I'll try to go into the details of what Biten, and I try to expand on those points. So definitely, like if you look at from a quality system standpoint, I mean, there's a design control and quality system is key actually. So if you want to have a partner who have the similar identical quality system, or at least who understand your system in a way that they understand your design transfer, the inputs and the outputs, what you're trying to get out of this design is actually key. Understanding of the system, what the requirements are, is very key. Some of the aspects where when startup companies want to find in a development partner starts from a certification, what kind of certification they have, which is needless to say, ISO 13485 and those kind of certification, because that's where is a good representative of, it's a whole hierarchical certificate. Okay, if they're ISO 13485 certified, then they have the quality system in place. But again, that's when it starts actually. So having ISO 13485 is just a starting point. But now when you get into the nitty-gritty details of how they actually start to documenting, what Biten mentioned about documentation is actually a very critical part of medical device and regulated industry. So how they documented, what kind of documentation they have. And it starts from 3D capabilities and prototype development. Like if you're trying to work with a partner who you expect them to work on the 3D prototyping, what is a quick turnaround time they can do prototyping and testing for you? That's key because that builds up on your timeline pretty quick. I've seen projects where prototypes takes like 3 weeks, they take like 6 to 8 weeks, and that just pushes the timeline because the work that you do upfront, decides how you're going to validate and verify it later on, and that builds the whole base for the device. So that's where it starts, where you have a partner where you can do the prototyping and developments upfront and to the requirements that you can actually, you're expecting them to, the outputs that you are expecting them to, or, you have derived your specifications and they can meet your specification on time every time. That's, it starts with that process. And then of course, qualified experienced engineer. You don't want to work with a company who specializes in cardiovascular when your device is orthopedic. I mean, that's a totally different animal right there. So experience and qualified engineers. And then you want to have engineers who are actually who have the design transfer process well defined. So you can develop something quickly, but if you're expecting them to manufacture, then what kind of design transfer they can do? I've seen companies where the device is fantastic, but they miss all these points of what needs to be validated and how it needs to be validated and how it's documented. And they do a design transfer, and there is a big gap in what the specification is and what the specification they can actually derive when it goes to commercialization. One of the key aspects is very often misled is is missed is a CAPA system. Like as Biten suggested, what do you expect them? Do you expect them to manufacture it? But if you expect them to manufacture and commercialize it, well, once it gets to the field, then what is the post-surveillance market activity and quality control aspect? Like if you have complaints and how do you handle complaints? Who owns what? So right from, if I want to summarize it, if you start from the 3D prototype development and the quality system certification, and then the resources, and then after the devices launch in manufacturing and logistics, what happens after the device is commercial? That also is a key aspect of it. Not to mention packaging and labeling, which, of course, we're going to talk about it, but that's also a key aspect of what your developer partner capabilities are.
Right. So I'm going to just interrupt for 1 second. I know Jan Lin wants to comment too, which I'll get to in 1 second, but it sounds like from everything you guys are saying is that there's so many things that are typically maybe people think are further way downstream in terms of, delivering this product or, or data collection or other things that people might be thinking, I'll push these things off to later. I'm just going to focus over here. I'm not going to get into my quality system yet. I'm just going to work on, making sure the product works. But you're saying these things need to be there from the beginning. Is that right? Like, how soon do you want to have a quality system in place? I mean, is that from the very beginning? Is that like later? When do you do that?
So a couple of comments. So I'll answer your question first. There's a point in time that is perfectly reasonable to do a skunk's works kind of rig, right? And that's almost your literal proof of concept. It's the first time you put it together and say, oh, it actually can do something cool, right? So that one usually happens outside of a regulatory context because it's the first time that you've ever shown that is even worthwhile doing, okay? But the second that you go, oh, okay, now I need to make it a product, right? So I have done my homework and I have shown there is a market that's willing to pay for it. There is an unmet clinical need that benefits the patients. There is a gap in the market in terms of what already exists that can fill that need. So you do all your homework and you say, okay, no, this is something real that needs to exist in the world because it will help a lot of people with this condition. Okay, once you say that and you say it is a medical product, it's probably worthwhile start writing down things, right? And at the start, whether it's your PRS, product requirement specification, or your first risk register, there can be a lot of gaps. It can say, TBD. I know there's a risk here, but I'm not sure how to qualify it yet, so TBD. That's okay, but the point is, don't start building stuff until you've thought through all the if and there and buts of the whole project, right? Because what ends up happening is if you build in piecemeal, so you say, oh, I de-risk this part, this sensor. Well, you didn't de-risk how that sensor is in the entire system. So there is some other knock-on effect from some other part of the system that you didn't know about until you integrate 2 years later, and then you realize, oh, darn it, I have to do this again, right? So it's better to almost think before you build. And what a good QMS system or a good design process looks like is actually what you're taught as a good engineer, which is think before you do. So you write down what you're going to do, you think about the trade-offs, you do small things to de-risk parts of the project that are scary, And then once you think you have the whole picture together, then you start to build, right? And yeah, you might have to do one iteration, but you don't have to do 20 iterations because you've already thought through all the intricacies of how they, all the components interrelate. So definitely, I would say it is not just paperwork, which is, I think, the misconception a lot of startups have. A lot of startups says, oh, the real work is I'll build the thing, right? And I can do it on an animal model. And after that, I'll fill in the paperwork, which is the QMS. That's not really it. The QMS is the real work. It is the thought process that gets you to a very good product, a robust product that is repeatable and manufacturable. So definitely don't shortcut yourself on thinking that through. Okay. Now going back to your previous questions about what do you have to consider in a product design partner, I will follow up with Biten's comment that I agree with everything. There's just one more element that I'd like to add that I've seen sometimes there's a little bit of confusion, and that's the role of a design authority. Okay, so it's a term that we use that means who is ultimately responsible for the entire system working. Okay, so there are times where clients come to us and they say, I, the client, am the design authority. Everything works. It's just one component, this one component. It can be the optic system, let's say, that I'm having trouble with. Can you just jump in and troubleshoot that one component, right? And this is the inputs that I'm giving you. This is the outputs that I need. Just make it work. So yes, a partner like us or some other partner that is very good at optics can jump in and just do that component for you and fix it, fine. However, if you're getting a project help in for many different components, so there's a lot of interrelatedness, then you need somebody with a strong background and experience level in basically system architecting the entire thing, right? And and in many ways, that's what you term the design authority. Ultimately, they're responsible for making all the different components work, whether it's between yourself, the startup, and the design partner, or it may involve even 3 parties. So I've seen combinations where there's an academic center or a clinical center involved that's doing a certain component, the startup doing a certain component, and then the product design partner, or even 2 companies that have come together to join the IP and then a design partner. In those kind of situations, it's very easy for everybody to do their part and not think about the big picture as to how it all fits together and what the overall risks are or what the overall design has to perform at, not just their individual components. So that's where I say, if you are a startup that is so lucky to have, somebody on the team that is a, 20-year experience in medtech, system architect, then yeah, be the design authority, take that on, manage all the partners, manage all the different work streams, own it all. But if you don't, there is a serious consideration to say, I may need actually a design authority to help me get, further part of the way until I can hire somebody like that in-house to manage all the different work streams. So, and that's a really important, I think, consideration when you design a design partner. There are design partners out there that are very specialized. So they specialize in optics, or they specialize in microfluidics, or they specialize in algorithms and sensors. And then there's others that are, larger, and so have all these things under one house. And so if you're looking for somebody who can manage all the different moving parts, you may want to go with a larger partner. If you only have, one core thing that you're looking for, potentially you can go with a boutique consultancy that is very specialized in that area. So again, something to think about in terms of the scale of what you need in terms of capability.
Great. All right. I don't want to get spend too much more time on that. I want to be able to make sure we cover a lot. So, so let's move on and talk a little bit about just innovation in general and product development. We've, earlier, Biten and others, mentioned speed to market is really important. And you're making a trade-off and, in terms of how quickly you go. Another one is cost. And I know in Asia Pacific, Broadly speaking, keeping down cost and maybe worldwide is very important. Super high priority, in terms of Asia Pacific. And so one of the things that I want to just quickly get some of your thoughts on is the trade-off for being more or less sophisticated when developing a product. Like, for example, you could do something, with a syringe for injection, or you could have a super sophisticated electronic pump component that's digitally connected and does other things. And there's a trade-off between, time to market. And so I think just kind of generally speaking, what is your thoughts on this trade-off of innovation and sophistication and time to market? Where do you see those things? And I'll go to Biten first for this.
All very interesting question. And again, another dilemma which we all face when we are thinking about innovation. If you ask the techies on the team, they always want to go for sophistication, right? Because we can really bring in the engineering innovation muscle and give the best-in-class product. But again, going back to how do you go to speed to market? A critical part of that speed to market analysis is being upfront on who is your customer, particularly in Asia, where insurance and reimbursement models may be very, very different, and in some markets completely lacking, and even in some certain disease states lacking. You first want to figure out your consumer customer segmentation strategy. That is very, very critical to make those design choices. You could go to a very, very mature high-ended customer who's used to a very high-ended product and is dealing with like a surgeon who's dealing with very complicated surgeries, works in the best-in-class tertiary care hospital, and his or her demand and needs and threshold for what is an acceptable product, and therefore a surgical practice or a healthcare delivery practice may be very, very different than a up-and-coming new procedure or a new entrant, 5 years, 10 years of experience, and with a keen desire to make sure that every patient gets a clinical outcome impact, never mind what device or product or self skills the surgeon ends up using in a procedure. So you have to be very clear, first and foremost, who's your target segment. If you're going to go behind the top end one, then you've got to go behind the sophistication. At the same time, you need to be answering yourself, are you making a Me Too product, and are you going to get there on time? And are you going to be able to compete with the competition who's already serving that market? If you're making a product which is already existing, unless it's a de novo, what's your core difference? Are you trying to make a product which is cheaper? Are you trying to give a clinical outcome difference? Or are you giving better ergonomics outcomes, etc.? So you have to be very clear on that. If you're going behind a completely new disruptive procedure, then it's more about what's the absolute must-have in terms of efficacy, proving the efficacy of your device and the safety of a device. The procedure itself might be a bit cumbersome, and you could live with that because even the surgeon or the healthcare provider will understand that your first version of your device may not be the most efficient device. So you focus on A, the segment, B, what is the key value proposition against competition in which you want to deliver in making that choice. And the third one is whether it's an existing product, technology, procedure, or a new one, and therefore you make a choice between efficiency versus sophistication. But never compromise, irrespective of these scenarios on your customers, never compromise on the core efficacy of your product, which relates to clinical outcomes, and the second one is safety. Those are the two things you don't want to compromise on.
Okay, well, let me related to this in terms of choices that you're making as an early stage company or even a larger company. One of the questions that comes up for all the time is the question of off-the-shelf components versus technology that you're developing completely in-house. And I know we've already talked a little bit about this in terms of partners who have some of these capabilities versus reinventing things yourself. And I guess one of the questions is, again, is it advisable to start with off-the-shelf components in that proof of concept phase versus custom components? And what are some of the risks that are involved with custom components versus off-the-shelf that, again, maybe people aren't really thinking about? And what have been some of the problems, perhaps? And I know, Santhosh, you brought up some of these, so let me go to you for this.
Thanks, Paul. I think this is a fantastic question, and this is actually a very common question, especially with startup companies. They want to get to first to market, and obviously, as I said, prototyping and 3D prototyping and testing takes a lot of time. So companies take this approach of starting with off-the-shelf components, and they proceed with the design development activities, all the testing and all those whole 9 yards with the design control. And then when they get to manufacturing, they start doing their custom devices. Well, now the critical component that is a key core of any development is the design control. So your specification that you take with the off-the-shelf device, let's say for example a cannula, and you're taking the off-the-shelf cannula and you have a certain diameter and certain thickness of the tube. Well, when you translate that to a custom made, your thickness or your diameter cannot be the same or won't be the same. Or it's a simple example, but there are complicated devices where you have more than 7 or 8 critical components, or even more than that. And not all critical components or critical dimensions you're going to match with off the shelf, because it's basically off the shelf. It's meant to be like in general. And then you have a custom made device which has more critical components but doesn't match. Well, guess what? You have a design change right there. So you cannot proceed. So you're going back to the start if you are changing the critical dimensions. So if you are using, my only advice is, if you're using the off-the-shelf components, then select a device or select the component which is not as critical, which doesn't have too many of critical dimensions, which you're going to later change. Now, every critical dimension, if you follow the design FMEA and the process FMEA, has, every critical aspect has risk associated with it. Well, if you have a critical dimension, which is different between these two components, a custom made and off the shelf, basically you are changing the risk level, and that takes you back to the design input stage. And if you follow the documentation thoroughly, then it's a lot of work. It's actually going back to from the start of the project. So my only advice, going back again and again, I've seen companies taking off the shelf components and running with it, but they actually miss a key component of criticality and design control aspect, which can later, come in and, put them in trouble when they actually go for commercialization or even verification validation. Also, I've seen a difference between components being used for prototyping and then components being used for verification validation. And I've seen companies coming up with big surprises when they try to verify the design aspect, because now the verification is not the same. They're not able to meet the specification, or they're not able to meet the design output with the specification that they actually started with. So my advice is, if they want to use off-the-shelf component, then they would actually look into simple components that will not matter to them down the line. So, and if they have more the critical dimension, just match the critical dimension, and then make sure the design control process is followed from the start to the end.
Thanks. And I'm sure some others might want to comment, but just quickly, I want to make sure I address this, because not everyone who's watching would know the difference. So what is the difference between verification and validation? Biten.
So again, this is something which we all toggle between, right? And what's the most efficient way to do this? Verification, and I'm going to put it in layman's language. I'm not going to put it into the quality systems language out here, because that's why I think everyone can go and read ISO 13485 and how it defines it. But a very simple way to kind of try and remember this is, verification is everything which you can prove with quantified engineering values and numbers, and can do it in-house in your lab and prove that it works, and you can document those results. Validation is when you need to put the product out in the hands of the end user, in the end user ecosystem, and make sure that the end user validates for you, saying, yes, this works and I'm getting the expected outcome. And you are able to do it across multiple different scenarios, patient demographics, and document that as evidence of validating your device.
And your plans for actually executing those things are very different between the two, right, as well?
Absolutely. One is a very strong engineering plan. The other is going to be either in a scenario where you need to prove efficacy and safety, you're going to be doing validation with a very detailed clinical study with real life subjects and experts, and sometimes you'll be ending up in a first in human scenarios. And sometimes it could be purely simple validation in terms of consumer feedbacks, customer feedbacks, or healthcare practitioner feedbacks by allowing them to use the product, handle the product. And again, it depends, the rigor on validation depends on the classification of your device. But your verification engineering principles is all about proving your engineering principles. It's about completing your risk management roster and your input-output document, and making sure that what you started as a design intent at the input is now proven with your design output through your verification reports.
All right. Now I want to talk a little bit about user-centered design, since again, we're talking about sophistication of technology. We're talking about who's going to be using this product, studies to measure that and validate that. Just backing up a little bit, human-centered design, it's a concept that people have been talking about for years. Should everything today be done with the user at the center, the patient at the center, whoever's going to be the center of that chart? Are we at the point where everything should be done that way? Yanlin?
Yeah, and I think increasingly it's a requirement now in most regulatory systems.
Yep.
So it's not something you can dodge. And frankly, I think it's good practice to check that you actually know who the end user is. Because a lot of times people make assumptions, oh, obviously it's going to go in clinic, and people have a mindset of, oh, in clinic means a doctor, right? But quite often it could be a nurse. Sometimes it could even be a technician, right? And you have different requirements for those different roles in terms of where the device is going to live, so i.e. the setting that it's going to exist in, and the person and the skill level of that person who is going to be using it. So, and as we see, even in very simple things like lateral flow tests. So, right now we're in COVID times, there are a lot of lateral flow tests being used, these antigen tests. And what you see is in the hands of a skilled user, i.e. a trained user, a healthcare professional of some sort, the accuracy is higher than a home use test. And it can be the exact same test, right? Why? Why is that? Well, it comes down to how good is the human factors in the design that basically means that there is only one way to do it, and it is the right way, and there's no deviation. Now, that's very, very hard to achieve. That's a very, very high bar to meet. And just to give you an example, again, lateral flow test, because it's kind of pertinent right now. The first HIV home use test was developed by OraSure. It took them about 10 years to get certification for home use, even though that technology had existed for over 20 years already in the market, because there was such a high bar on usability, right? So depending on the class and the user that you're designating as the end user of your product, you may have to do a lot of human factor studies. It can be potentially the bulk of your submission sometimes, if it's a first-time de novo product that is safety critical but home use, right? So usually for a first-time product, I think you'll get the common advice is go to clinic first, right? And then step down from there to a less skilled user class, and then eventually end up in a home use setting. So usually people say, clear certification, clear waiver, and then over the counter, right? Those are the common pathways to market to try to overcome some of the requirements around human factors. But absolutely, you cannot run these days from needing to do all these user-centric studies.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, please go ahead.
One more point to that. I think Yanlin is absolutely right. Just something for us to keep in the back of the mind. Human-centered design has always been critical to medical devices. It's just that the understanding and how deep we are going into that has expanded in a few different dimensions. So if you go back to even the basics of risk management, implementing applications FMEA, where you're having your engineers think about how this product is going to be used by the end user, has always been the case. What gets it even more prominent today is, in the past, it was always about only the doctors or the surgeons being in the center of who the user is. But as you're seeing more and more engagement and interactions and more implants coming through, the consumer side is becoming front and center. So you no longer cannot afford to think about only the doctor or the surgeon, but also as the consumer. And the usage ecosystem, as to Yanlin's point, is changing. And that makes it even more difficult. And then finally, usability analysis, hazard analysis, these are all becoming critical part of your design control deliverables. Another big one which is coming out in surgery today, when you talk about human factors, it's not just about the end user and this ecosystem, but it's also about end user fatigue. So even highly skilled users like surgeons, when they're ending up doing 6, 7, 8 surgeries in a day, how good is the grip on your product? Is the doctor, when he's doing the surgery, the first surgery at 7 a.m. in the morning, using that device time and time again, and the same surgery, same doctor doing it at 12 p.m. in the afternoon, which is surgery number 4 and 5? What's the fatigue which has been induced by the device usage, which leads to errors in surgery? These are becoming very critical factors of those hazard analysis, where human-centered design is very critical today.
And as you mentioned before, I think, Jan Lin, part of this is a regulatory requirement as well, depending on what market you are in. All right, let's talk about a couple other topics here in the last 10 minutes or so that we've got in the public broadcast. So packaging, Santhosh, you mentioned that earlier. At what point in the process do you start thinking about packaging? Is this something you do very far down the road after everything else is done, or is this something you're thinking about in the beginning? Where should we start?
Thank you, Paul, for asking that question. It's my favorite question in the design development phase, actually, especially with companies, startup companies, where packaging, or most of the companies, not even startups, actually, it's an afterthought. And I give an example from a risk standpoint, actually. So in any design control process, and if you have an FMEA and DFMEA, and if you lay out the risks, there could be components of the device which has less risk, less aspect of risk. Let's say a risk level 3 or 2, 5 being the highest one. But in any design control process or any company, if you look at sterile barrier, it's always 5. It's always the highest risk, because if you lose the sterile barrier, then the device has nothing. I mean, if you tell a doctor like, hey, it's a fantastic device, but by the way, it's non-sterile, the doctor's not going to use it at all, like no matter how fantastic the device is. And that's the job of what packaging does. So that's, early to answer your question. Yeah, it has to start from right from the start. When development of the device starts, the packaging has to start. And the reason why it has to start from the beginning is, as the device component changes, your challenge to the sterile barrier system also changes. So a device which has started like a round ball can, develop over the time with round ball with spikes on it. And now if you have spikes on it, and just give an example, that can, challenge the sterile barrier system during transportation. So as the device evolves, so has the packaging, and the changes, the fit, form, and function of packaging changes. The other aspect of packaging is not only packaging, but labeling. Packaging is, at least, there is some aspect that companies think about it, but labeling is definitely, in most cases, I would say 90% of the companies, an afterthought. Even well-developed companies have mislabeling as a key aspect, and information like the new MDR requirements is focused on labeling. What information goes on the label, is a single barrier, double barrier. So to answer your question, packaging and labeling needs to start from the beginning. Like, you need to partner with a company, and we have seen startups who are ready to launch the device, and they come back and they say, oh, what kind of packaging we need? And we start asking questions like, does it need moisture barrier? Does it need UV barrier? And they start answering the question, and they're like, oh my God, we didn't think about it. And they have to go back to the drawing board and redefine the devices and modify the device just to fit into packaging. And packaging has 2 aspects: sterile barrier system and protective packaging. So sterile barrier system is a primary packaging which provides the sterile barrier, and there is a second level which is protective packaging, which is the carton and the shipper, and that adds value where actually the device goes into the hospital. Well, not all brown boxes are allowed to go into the emergency room. So now you are in a dilemma, like you cannot transfer this device. You have transferred the device from manufacturer to the hospital, like to the dock of the hospital. But how does it get transferred from the hospital to the emergency room? That's another level of discussion, and that's another level of packaging expertise that needs to happen, thought on it. So my answer to all the startup companies is, please engage packaging and labeling activities right from the beginning. Engage with a good partner who can support you right from the beginning and right from the start.
All right, so we've only got 5 minutes left in the public broadcast, which is amazing that we've gone this fast. So I want to get to one question, which is really important, and it's about avoidable mistakes. So you guys have all been involved with development from early companies to late stage, and there's mistakes that are avoidable. So what are some common avoidable mistakes that you see people make over and over again when it comes to product development and manufacture? Well, let's not get into manufacturing. Let's just stick to product development. And what don't people think about maybe that will come back to bite them later? So I'm going to start with you, Yan, for this.
I think one of the common ones is actually human factors. Quite often people leave that way too late. So, they're already almost at design freeze and they say, oh, okay, I have to do human factors now. Well, that's a really bad time to start that, because quite often, if that's your first human factor studies, you are going to throw up a lot of changes, right? Even if it's quote unquote minor changes, like where you position a button on a particular device to make it slightly more ergonomic, or how the workflow steps, to work that device, that kind of stuff. But that's huge implication in terms of your product development, because you're already at such a late stage. So now you have to go back and justify why you didn't do that study beforehand, right? And it's very hard to justify because you really should have. So that's actually a really common error, I think, partially because in the sort of the rush of technical engineering, a lot of times people don't think about the soft stuff, and so it gets left by the wayside. The other thing that happens as well is thinking about, I know you said don't talk about manufacturing, but thinking about manufacturing too late. So if you are thinking about manufacturing after you have a design, it is too late already, because component selection, material selection is part of manufacturing, right? So if you have selected materials that are very, very costly or near impossible to get tolerances at that level in sort of mass manufacturing settings, then you have to go back and do a very, very significant redesign, right? So when we look at manufacturing in our process, we start thinking about manufacturing as we do detailed design. So after the initial sort of system architecture stage, and you say, okay, now let's start designating what the parts we're going to use, exactly what the tolerances are. We're already thinking about who the suppliers could be at the end of the day, who are the manufacturers at the end of the day, and what are the manufacturing processes that could be used to achieve this. A lot of times it is an afterthought, especially for startups, and they come to me and say, oh, I just need a manufacturer that can give me 100 pieces of this. And I look at them and it's like, that's going to be near impossible, because that process is either you spend $2 million and you have a custom piece that you can mass manufacture in the millions, or you're going to spend a few $1,000s per piece, which you really don't want to, right? And you're at that point, it's kind of too late. So that's something to think about as well. If you're doing your design, you should be already thinking about manufacturing.
All right, great. Thank you for some of those points, Yan Lin. Let me go to you, Santhosh.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add 2 key points where I've seen. So I've been in the audit. I'm a trained auditor, ISO 13485 auditor, and I've seen in the auditing world, not only from an audit standpoint, but I've faced enough auditors. And then the common mistakes, 2 common mistakes that comes to my mind that companies have missed during the design phase is, one, what needs to be validated, like what aspect, what features needs to be validated. And I'll give an example of tooling fixture, for example. So in the manufacturing line, in the design aspect, the tooling fixtures, companies don't realize that they need to be validated. For example, what's called like TFIQ, tooling fixture installation qualification. That needs to happen. Every tooling fixture, every component of that tooling fixture needs to have a drawing, and then needs to have, needs to be validated. And the second part associated with that is test method validation. So every test that is critical to the device, be it just a fixture test, fixed test, or something which is critical to the device, that needs to have a test method validation. So the determination of what needs to be validated, and the determination, if it needs to be validated, what test methods needs to be validated. These 2 are the key aspects that I've seen a lot of companies missing the point and getting like warning letters from the FDA, just observations from the FDA and regulatory bodies. So there's a lot more to that, but then from a design standpoint, these are the 2 key points where I would recommend, like what needs to be validated, and the test method validation during the design phase.
Good points to consider. All right, Biten, you get the last word on this.
Well, thank you, Paul. I'll end by saying three things. Number one, stay close to your end user and customers. Don't go to them only at the start when you do the proof of concept and then you're going to the validation stage. Keep a continuous connect and review, an ongoing review with your end users and customers. Have one or two SMEs from the clinical field and the end user field be a part of your development journey. So that's one. Because you might find that the external scenario is changing and you need to make sure that you continue to be sharp on your efficacy and safety. Second one is be very close to your risk management documentation. Don't again make it a process which you do for the sake of documenting at the end, because if you truly do it in a detailed way, you will be able to uncover challenges in your development process, both in terms of all three: application, design, process, which essentially talks to design to manufacture, as Yandin mentioned earlier, and of course the business risks. So stay close to your risk management. And then finally, the last one I would say is don't get too tied with your design. Don't get too engaged with one particular way of solving the problem. If your risk management, if your customers give you feedback that something is not working, recognize that early on and see if you need to make changes early on. You put those small things under the carpet and they give you big surprises at the end.
Good points, good advice. All right, so we're at our first hour here. I want to make sure companies that are watching on YouTube know how to reach out and connect with all of you if they're interested. So Santhosh, how do people find you?
So a lot of companies have, they find us through our customers, because we have been in the industry for more than 50 years now, and other aspects, general aspect like marketing, through marketing leads and stuff. But I think packaging is such a niche field, and our presence in this region is actually critical. So they come for development right from the start, and companies who have no idea of packaging have reached out to us, and that's how they find us.
Yeah, and how do we find you literally? So LinkedIn, the website,
LinkedIn,
how do they contact?
Yeah, we have a website on oliver@cp.com, and we can share my personal address, smadiwal@oliver@cp.com. They can virtually. I'm based in Singapore, in Science Park 1, and if they are based in Singapore, they can come and meet us. We have a technical center in Science Park, and so website or email. I'm on LinkedIn, so any avenues, they can reach out to me.
Well, I know a lot of our alumni have worked closely with Oliver Healthcare Packaging and been super happy. And I know that your team is also really helpful in terms of just thinking through a lot of these things that we've been talking about, even before you start working together. So I encourage people to reach out. So thank you, Santhosh. Yan Lin.
Yeah, so you can reach us at cambridgeconsultants.com. We have 6 different offices globally, so you can contact the one that is most geographically relevant to you. I'm based in the Singapore office and I take care of APAC. So feel free to reach out to the Singapore office, and you can just email us. All the website information to all the different offices are on the website. So just reach out. Looking forward to talk to you.
Yeah, no, again, tons of our startups have interacted with Yan Lin along the way, and just a tremendous resource. So thank you for being part of the ecosystem, Yan Lin. And then Biten, how do people connect with you?
Again, LinkedIn, best way to reach out, and I'm happy to share my email address into the chat window, so people can always reach out anytime.
Terrific. So we barely scratched the surface today and talked about a lot of different topics. So I'm glad we had a chance to cover some of these. There's a lot more to go. We're going to stick around for another 30 minutes with our cohort to answer their questions, or at least 25 minutes. But I want to thank all the panelists for a great discussion. You raised a lot of really interesting points, things for people to consider. We didn't even get into digital and AI and other considerations for product development, so there's lots more to talk about. We are going to be talking about manufacturing in the subsequent webinar, which is why I was trying to table some of that. But you're right, Yan Lin, we got to be thinking about manufacturing from the very beginning. So I agree completely. But again, thank you, panelists. You guys have been terrific. stick around for our Q&A. And again, for everybody on YouTube, thanks for being here. medtechinnovator.org/APAC live is where you can find our schedule for upcoming webinars. You can subscribe, so we'll send you notifications to make sure that you get an advance notice before we go live. So thanks for being with us today. We're going to stop the